Misfortune did not knock. It crashed upon Eleanor Hartwell with the force of a verdict long prepared against her. The night storm had already soaked through her thin cloak, but it was the sharp, merciless chorus of society's whispers following her through the streets that chilled her more deeply. She had once been welcomed among those polished voices. Now they trailed her like scavengers, certain she would fall. Her father's death, the forged letter, the scandal that named her a shameless pursuer of a married man. None of it had been her doing, yet all of it had become her burden. By the time she reached the towering gates of Whitmore Palace, she carried not hope but exhaustion, the quiet surrender of someone who has survived too much daylight and sought only a moment of shelter. Rain drummed in frantic rhythm upon stone, urging her forward toward the single place still illuminated against the city's indifference. Eleanor did not expect mercy at the gate, yet the cruelty that greeted her felt almost theatrical in its precision. Two young ladies descending from a lacquered carriage paused just long enough to recognize her, and recognition was all they required to unleash their polished disdain. Their voices, sweetened for public performance, carried easily through the rain as they spoke of her downfall, her desperate nature, her supposed hunger for male attention. Each phrase struck like a practiced blow, and Eleanor, too weary to defend herself, simply lowered her gaze. The gatekeeper, emboldened by their ridicule, stepped forward with officious gravity, blocking her path with a polished staff. He announced that only invited guests might enter, that the ball was no refuge for strays, and that her presence risked disturbing the sensibilities of decent company. Eleanor swallowed the ache rising in her throat, preparing to retreat into the storm, when a sudden hush rippled through the courtyard, as if the night itself inhaled. Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Evermere, had arrived. His presence carried a gravity that dissolved chatter and straightened spines, not through force but through a quiet authority that seemed carved from some older, sterner age. Lantern light caught the dark fabric of his coat, the subtle silver at his cuffs, the composed austerity of a man long accustomed to scrutiny, yet untouched by it. Eleanor recognized him at once, not personally, but by reputation. Society spoke of him with equal parts reverence and trepidation. A man whose kindness was rare, whose silence was formidable, whose loyalty once earned was absolute. He surveyed the scene with an unreadable expression, his gaze moving from the trembling young woman to the mocking ladies, then to the gatekeeper still barring her way. Something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of displeasure sharpened by a deeper emotion she could not identify. When he approached, the crowd parted instinctively, granting him passage as though he carried an invisible mantle of command. Eleanor braced herself, expecting further judgment, but his attention settled upon her with the startling gentleness. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his tone neither warm nor cold, but weighted with significance, as though her name had been waiting for his voice. The sound of it startled her. She had no recollection of ever being introduced to him. Before she could form a question, he turned to the gatekeeper with a calm severity that required no raised voice. He instructed that she be granted entry immediately, and when the man hesitated, Adrian's gaze silenced him more effectively than any shout could. Eleanor felt the stunned stares of the courtyard pressing against her, a tide of curiosity and disbelief ready to crash the moment she moved. She whispered that she had no right to enter, that she sought only a moment's shelter, but the Duke extended his hand, not insistently, but with a quiet assurance that dismantled her resistance. The gesture carried the weight of a verdict, yet its intention felt merciful rather than final. As she placed her trembling fingers against his, she sensed a steadiness that contrasted sharply with the storm within her. He guided her past the gatekeeper, past the whispering ladies, past the glittering threshold that separated disgrace from dignity. Every step beside him felt impossible, borrowed, a fragile reprieve granted by a man who owed her nothing. And yet, there was something deliberate in his protection, as though he recognized more in her than her tarnished reputation. He did not release her hand until they reached the shadowed archway leading into the palace's inner hall, where the distant murmur of celebration drifted like a reminder of the world she had lost. Eleanor attempted to speak, to thank him or question his intent, but Adrian lifted a steadying hand that quieted her before any words could escape. He told her she was safe, that no one inside would dare challenge her presence, while she walked beside him. His tone remained composed, yet she sensed a hidden intensity beneath it, a restrained anger that seemed directed not at her, but at the cruelty she had endured. The realization unsettled her. Why should a duke care for the humiliation of a woman society had discarded? For a moment they stood in stillness, the storm softening behind them, while candlelight flickered ahead. Eleanor felt her heartbeat shift, as if the act of being protected had stirred something she feared to name. She reminded herself that this was temporary, a kindness offered by a man who owed her nothing. And yet, the sincerity in his gaze suggested he had stepped into her defense with purpose, not impulse. It left her breath unsteady. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a quiet resolve that left no room for doubt. "If anyone questions you," he murmured, leaning close enough that she felt the warmth of his breath, "stay near me. You are my wife tonight." The words struck like thunder, impossible and irrevocable, and Eleanor felt the fragile ground of her life shift, as though the night had begun rewriting her fate without asking permission. Calamity struck the moment Eleanor stepped beside the Duke into the restless swell of the ballroom, for the orchestra faltered as if the very air recoiled from her presence. It was not the music alone that broke. The illusion of safety she had clung to shattered the instant society's collective gaze converged upon her, dissecting her history, her worth, her right to breathe in their gilded world. A tremor rose inside her, not from weakness, but from the cruel recognition that no sanctuary came without scrutiny. Yet Adrian's arm remained firm beneath her trembling hand, guiding her with steady composure as murmurs burst to life like embers landing upon dry ground. He introduced her, without hesitation, without apology, as his wife. Not a companion, not a guest, a wife. A declaration so bold it carved shock into the room's marrow. Eleanor felt the weight of the word press against her ribs, though false. It carried the force of truth when spoken by a man whose titles bent nations. She whispered that he need not go so far, but he responded with restrained conviction that society only understood claims forged in unmistakable language. His certainty steadied her for a heartbeat, yet fear of future consequences crept behind it, whispering that such a gesture could not be undone without cost. They moved through the crowd, each step tightening the knot of scandal around them. Eleanor sensed hostility prickling at her back, curiosity sharpening ahead of her. These were not harmless observers, but judges in silk gloves. Adrian, however, behaved as if escorting a queen, undeterred by whispers or narrowed eyes. The contrast between his calm strength and her quiet dread created an ache within her, for she feared she was becoming indebted in ways she could never repay. When they reached a secluded alcove, he removed a silver bracelet from his gloved hand, a piece of quiet elegance engraved with a lineage older than the kingdom's borders. He held it out with a sincerity that startled her. She knew what it meant. Every soul in the palace would know. It belonged not to guests or passing acquaintances, but to the Duchess alone. She tried to refuse, claiming she had borrowed enough protection already, but he persisted with a gentle firmness that left no room for retreat. He said the bracelet would serve as her shield, silencing malicious tongues before they gathered force. Reluctantly, she extended her wrist, and as he clasped the metal around her skin, a warmth unfurled within her, frightening in its intensity. She reminded herself that this was not affection but necessity, yet her heart refused to remain so disciplined. The orchestra resumed, and Adrian invited her to dance, not for pleasure but to consolidate the claim he had made. Eleanor hesitated, worried she would draw more ridicule if she stumbled, but he assured her in a low tone meant only for her ears that she need not perform for them, only for herself. When they stepped into the swirling company, she felt the eyes of dozens track her movements, searching for any imperfection to sharpen into gossip. Yet Adrian guided her with patient familiarity, each turn grounded by his steady rhythm. Their closeness created an intimacy neither intended, but both felt acutely. Her breath caught whenever his hand pressed lightly against her back, and she wondered whether he sensed a fragile tremor beneath her composure. Voices drifted around them, carrying cruel speculations of her past, her motives, her supposed ambition to entangle a duke. Though they pretended politeness, their barbed whispers struck her with painful precision. Adrian heard them too, For the first time since the night began, his restraint wavered, his jaw tightened, and he halted their dance long enough to address the offenders with chilling dignity. He reminded them that lineage offered no authority to malign a woman whose honor had been trampled by lies. His tone held no heated fury, only a lethal calm that rendered his words unforgettable. The offenders recoiled, offering strained apologies, but Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her. No one had defended her with such conviction before. Gratitude mingled dangerously with something deeper, something that threatened to grow if she allowed it. The dance ended, yet the tension it birthed lingered. Adrian led her through a side corridor toward a quieter chamber, shielding her from further scrutiny. She sensed the price he would pay for such open defiance, and the thought tightened her chest. She asked why he risked his reputation when he owed her nothing. He paused, studying her expression with an intensity that unsettled her. He replied that society's cruelty had gone unanswered for far too long, and though he spoke of injustice in general, something in his tone suggested her suffering affected him more deeply than he wished to admit. As the ball progressed, news of the Duke's wife began spreading beyond the palace walls. The notion of a secret marriage ignited excitement among gossipers, who arrived at the front gates demanding confirmation. Rumors coiled like storm clouds, threatening to overshadow every step Eleanor took. Adrian sensed a shift in the air and guided her away from the main hall, just as a cluster of noble women attempted to corner her with false cordiality. He dismissed them with a polite finality that left no room for pursuit. When the ball concluded, he insisted she remain in the palace for the night, citing the violent storm still raging outside. The offer struck her as both comforting and dangerous. She feared the impropriety, though the palace was vast enough to guarantee distance. Yet she also feared the comfort she felt in his presence, comfort that had begun weaving itself through her every breath. Still, exhaustion and uncertainty pushed her toward acceptance. In the quiet chamber the maid prepared for her, Eleanor removed the bracelet with trembling fingers, yet she could not bring herself to set it down. She felt its symbolic weight lingering against her skin, whispering that her fate had been nudged into new territory. As she settled near the faint glow of the dying hearth, she wondered what tomorrow would demand of her. She wondered, too, why the Duke had stepped into her story with such unwavering resolve, and what past wound or buried truth had driven him to make such a claim before the world. She did not yet know that the answer waited beyond dawn, ready to unravel everything she believed about him, about herself, and about the storm that had carried her to his door. The gunshot cracked through the night, like the sky splitting open, and for a single breath the world around them seemed to hold still. Maddox felt the vibration before he understood the sound, before his mind caught up with the frantic thud of his own heartbeat. He turned slowly, every muscle tight as a drawn wire, half fearing what he already sensed was true. The empty stretch behind him, the one he'd crossed 100 times with nothing but dust for company, now held danger he could not yet name, but could feel closing in with a cruel, deliberate patience. The silence that followed was not silence. It was expectation, pressure, the world waiting for something to step out of the dark and declare itself an enemy. Raven stood a few paces away, shoulders squared though her chest rose, and fell too fast, betraying the fear she tried to swallow. Her eyes darted between the dark horizon and Maddox, as if unsure which held the greater threat. She wanted to speak. He could see it in the parting of her lips, but something stopped her, something heavier than silence. He stepped closer, lowering his voice though no one else seemed near. "You heard it too," he murmured, not asking a question but confirming a truth neither wanted. She nodded once, sharply, the way someone does when the truth is cold and unwelcome. "It wasn't random," she whispered. "Someone knew we'd be out here." Maddox's fists tightened. They had left the settlement quietly, with no lanterns, no trail of sound. The only people who should have known their path were asleep miles away. Unless one wasn't. Unless someone had waited for this moment, waited for them to be alone, vulnerable, unguarded by the walls they both resented yet relied on. A second sound followed, not a gunshot, but a shuddering metallic ring, the kind a loose horseshoe makes when kicked by something harder than ground. Maddox froze. Raven's hand went instinctively to the small knife she kept strapped to her thigh. He motioned for her to stay behind him, though he knew she wouldn't listen. She never had, not since the day he first met her standing defiant before a crowd that wanted her gone. Together they moved as one, silent steps over brittle dirt, toward the abandoned wagon half collapsed into the earth. A shadow shifted. Maddox lifted his hand, signaling stillness, but Raven edged forward with a determination that made his stomach twist. The shadow straightened, tall and unsteady, swaying as though the earth beneath it had turned soft. They held their breath as moonlight finally grazed the figure's face. A man, no, barely more than a boy, stumbled into full view, clutching his side where something dark and wet spread across his shirt. His eyes flicked up, wild and desperate, and he tried to speak, but all that came out was a ragged gasp before his knees buckled. Raven caught him before he fell. Maddox dropped beside them, pressing his hand against the wound though the boy flinched in pain. "Who did this?" Maddox asked, firm but not unkind. The boy trembled, fighting for each breath. "They're coming," he rasped, eyes rolling toward the hills. "I tried to warn." His sentence broke as his head sagged forward. Maddox felt the dread rise like floodwater. Whoever they were, they weren't far, and the boy had not wandered there by accident. Raven touched Maddox's wrist. "We have to go," she said softly, urgency trembling beneath her calm. He knew she was right, yet something in him resisted leaving the boy who had sought them specifically. He glanced again at the dark smear on the boy's shirt, the fresh trail he must have left behind. Someone would follow that trail, someone who wanted him silenced. Just as Maddox slid his arms beneath the boy to lift him, the ground shuddered with the steady rhythm of approaching hooves. Raven's eyes widened, reflecting the same dread that punched through Maddox's chest. They were out of time. A single voice rose from the darkness, cold as a drawn blade. "Step away from him, rancher." The command echoed across the barren land, settling over them like a threat carved in stone. Raven's grip tightened on her knife. Maddox slowly stood, placing himself between her and the unseen riders. Behind him, the boy stirred faintly, enough to whisper a final warning Maddox barely caught. "If he finds the letter, none of you are safe." The words chilled Maddox to the bone. A letter. Something written, something hunted, something dangerous enough to kill for. And someone out there already knew Maddox, now carried the boy who tried to protect it. Maddox did not move, though every instinct screamed to grab Raven and run into the canyon's narrow cut. But fleeing blind was a gamble. He needed to see the men who thought they owned the night. He lifted his chin as faint silhouettes emerged, 3 riders, maybe 4, their outlines wavering in the stirred dust. Raven stepped closer, her shoulder brushing his arm in a quiet vow of shared danger. The lead rider halted just beyond the moon's reach. "That boy doesn't belong to you," he said. "Hand him over, and you walk away with your life." The offer held no mercy. Maddox felt the boy's warning coil through him. If he finds the letter. Maddox didn't have it. Truth didn't matter. Raven spoke first. "He's bleeding out. If you wanted him alive, you wouldn't have shot him." Silence tightened. Maddox sensed reins pull, temper sharpen. The rider exhaled. "Last chance." Maddox stepped forward. "You'll ride to me first." The rider nudged his horse into the light, revealing a scar across his jaw, one Maddox hadn't seen in years. The sight hit like a buried memory clawing free. Raven whispered, "You know him?" Maddox swallowed. "I did, and that's the worst part." The rider's cold smile widened, carrying a promise Maddox wished he didn't understand. "Then you know how far I'll go," the man said. Behind him, the others inched forward, ready. Raven steadied her breath, gripping her knife. Maddox felt the night tighten around them, the next moment poised to break wide open.